Hi, Jeff. Thank
Hey.
you so much for being, for helping us with this. And I want to introduce Father Daniel, who is going to lead. He's the assisting clergy, and he's going to lead us in an invocation. And then I'm going to turn it over to Muriel. So welcome again, Father Daniel.
Thank you, Sonia. And thank you, Father Golliher, for being here with us, for coming back. I'm probably the one that knows you the least out of the crowd. So it's wonderful to meet you and have the privilege of being with you and hearing you speak. I'm so excited. And welcome everybody for coming and joining. The peace of the Lord, or sorry, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Dear God, we give you thanks for this life, for this creation which is abundant with your spirit. We give you thanks for bodies, for minds that can discern your presence in each and everything that we encounter in this world. We give you thanks for this opportunity to come together, to hear and reflect on the beauty of that creation, for all the signs of resurrection around us in this moment, signs and symbols that we pray will give us hope as we move through treacherous times. Give us minds and hearts and ears that can be open to small graces and wisdoms that will arise from our time together. Bless Father Golliher in his own wisdom and his own discernment of your blessings. And we give you thanks for this day, for this moment, for these people, for this community. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to welcome our speaker. Today we have the pleasure of having Reverend Canon Jeffery Golliher to speak about climate change and sacred ecology. Some of us have known Father Golliher for a long time when he was with us at the Cathedral. Presently, he is in Upstate New York, where he is the Episcopal Missioner for Sullivan County and Rondout here in the Diocese of New York. And he's part-time priest at Ellenville, St. John's Memorial Episcopal Church. In addition, he is with the Franciscans, where he is Assisting Minister Provincial for Sacred Ecology, Society of St. Francis, Province of the Americas, Third Order. Welcome, Father Golliher.
Thank you. Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Is it loud enough and everything like that?
Yes.
Okay. I want to thank you. This is just great. Actually, it's fun. It's just fun to see. I mean, to see all these faces from. You know how that it's been almost 20 years that I was at the Cathedral. 20 years. It's hard for me to believe. So this goes back. So Reverend Daniels, for me, this goes back. I went to the Cathedral in 1991 out of seminary and was there about 13 or 14 years, something like 13 years, I guess, something like that. And loved it. That was an interesting time. I mean, now's an interesting time too. And so now I live 2 hours north of the city. I'm in the Diocese still in New York. I'm near the Catskills, really in the foothills of the Catskills. And so what's happened with me is that about 2 years ago, I officially retired, but there's no such thing as retirement in the church. So I'm working part-time and the bishop gave me a new job title, but I'm spending a lot more time working with the Franciscans. So St. Francis Day was important for me when I was at St. John the Divine. But I was also a member of the order too. I don't really know if y'all remember that, but that's a big part of my life now. And so I'm working globally with the Franciscans on all of the environmental justice issues, and especially with around indigenous peoples, really. Especially in the last 2 years, we have a global initiative going. For example, you might have heard about what's happening in Brazil. The Amazon is being deforested pretty rapidly with the current administration there, which means that the indigenous peoples are, being driven off their land or basically killed, is what happens. And so we're mobilizing the Franciscan order with indigenous leadership around the world in order to try to turn that around. That will be a big task, as you may know. So that's what else. If you have questions or comments, I really would like you to find a way to let me know and just interrupt me or whatever, okay? Before we start, how much time do we have, Muriel?
I think about an hour.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and start, and we'll look at the big picture around, the title is Climate Change and Sacred Ecology, and let's think of it in terms of just what's happening with the fabric of life on the earth, and not just climate, but everything. I think you may know that the best scientific estimate now is that we globally will need to cut carbon emissions by half by 2030, less than 10 years. That's tall order. That's not new news. Scientists have known this generally have known that for probably 10 or 15 years or more. But in the last, 4 or 5 years, climate has been considered to be, unreal by much of the American public. And so we have to overcome that problem. So it's cut by half by 2030, and we need to be carbon neutral by 2040 or thereabouts, maybe 2050 at the most. But I don't want to seem alarmist or anything like that. I'm just telling you the facts, the way things are, okay? Are we all on the same page about that, more or less? Okay. I'm trained, before I became an Episcopal priest, I worked as an anthropologist and had a lot of training in geoscience. And so some of the, I do keep track of the scientific studies that come out. In fact, years ago, this goes back a long ways, but I studied climatology with one of the people more recently that was considered that became a climate denier. And it was really interesting to have been in a classroom with him in the 70s, because it was at that time, the climate issue wasn't as clear as it is today. And I don't want to mention any names or anything, but what was really happening, I'm trying to make this more human, just so you can understand it. But in the classroom, he was really trained in a way of thinking that was like 50 years before that, like around World War II. And people understood statistics in a different way. And he really liked to be in front of a camera too. I mean, it was just in the nature of his personality. And I think a few years ago, when he was offered the job working with the Republican Party, actually, as to deny climate, for him it was a great opportunity, to get a lot of, I don't know, airtime almost. He was a good guy, actually, and it wasn't a great climatology class, but he was smart, but he was but trained in a different world than we live in now. And a lot of the reason I'm bringing that up is that a lot of the debates about whether the climate crisis is really a climate emergency now is the right word. A lot of the debate about that is coming obviously from the fossil fuel industry. They've invested a lot of money in trying to protect themselves from lawsuits. You know, this has been going on for about 10 years. Exxon is getting the most lawsuits. Not all of the energy companies have taken that approach. Some of them are working very hard to move to a different form of energy, and they want to invest in clean energy. So it's not all of the fossil fuel industry is the problem here. But what has happened in the United States, of course, is that those interests have gotten a hold of the American political system right now and a lot of the media. And a lot of the struggle that we're facing now is, to make a long story short, is like getting our democracy back, living at a time where the economic forces are controlling the democratic process more than we might realize. But that's pretty much the case. Okay, so, and that seems to be happening. I read in the news this morning, though, like if we want to cut the carbon emissions, it's not just about our, cars or heating oil. It's also about agriculture. 40%, 30 to 40% of the greenhouse emissions come from unsustainable forms of agriculture. It's kind of industrial agriculture, where the corporate world is taking over food production around the world, disenfranchising local communities and cultures and kicking them off their land, basically. Deforestation happens that way. And then there's much more cattle raising and beef production, soybean and beef production, that is also creating carbon emissions. And I read this morning that some of the biggest banks in the US are getting ready to to lessen their ties with the oil industry, but they're investing in industrial agriculture. Citibank, for one, JP Morgan, Bank of America, and two others. And that's a big mistake. So they'll be making a lot of claims that they're moving in a green direction, but they're not really. It's like they're kind of gambling, sort of hedging their bets. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Okay, so climate is one part of a fragile ecology, global ecology. The other part is just the sheer rate of extinction of species. We're talking about anywhere between 20 to 30, sometimes 40, 50% of amphibians, insects, and so on are facing extinction. Are y'all aware of that? I'm not sure how much people really know these days. And the reason for it is quite literally the loss of habitat, where, for example, in the Amazon, the forests are just being cut. That means that the living beings there will die. And what this means is that the whole kind of fabric of life on Earth is being torn. Okay? And what the situation that we're in now, from a religious point of view, I understand it as like we're on a pilgrimage now, or it's like, in effect, we need to be crossing the Red Sea. And where we are now is living in a way and at a time when the fabric of life is being torn apart. We have to cross that stormy water and get to a place where we're living in a respectful and loving way with God's creation. I mean, it's just words in a way, but it's really like that. And the disruption of the ecosystems that we face is not separate from the issues of racial justice, for example. It's all a manifestation of seeing some part of God's creation as less than living, less than real, less than human, less than worthy of respect, and then creating reasons in our minds and for exploiting, people, or where they live, or taking their land and creating reasons for it and saying, well, they're not fully human anyway, those people. That's what we did with slavery, right? So what we're trying to do, to use modern words, is kind of decolonize the world we live in. It's a modern form of colonization that's going on. We don't officially live in a colonial world anymore. You know, that was the British and the French and Spanish Empire several hundred years ago. But we have been recolonizing in a different way, subjecting people through different and ecosystems through different processes. So the pilgrimage. So this is the crossing of the Red Sea, and Pharaoh does not want us to make it to the other side. It's just like it has always been in that sense. Okay. So in that way, it's nothing new. It's just that the scale of it is much larger. It's global now. And that is why it is so disturbing. I mean, not that it's not always been disturbing, but we're talking now about the possibility, if these trends continue without us turning it around, then within 100 years, let's say, and that's a kind of an estimate scientists say, human life could be so disrupted that our cities may not be functional, for example. The migrations that we have now, like at the Mexican border, you know, these are thousands of people that are coming up throughout Central America, especially in Guatemala. And the reason for that is that their agricultural systems in Guatemala have been so disrupted by more intense tropical storms and deforestation that they can't make a living there. Now that's going to be happening all over the world. I mean, this is not a new thing. It's not going to go away. We can't just solve the problem in the way that we are now. We have to figure out how we're going to create a life together. It sounds pretty much, doesn't it? It's just, I was trained, you know, early on when I was an anthropologist too. I received a lot of training from Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian liberation theologian. And he used to say that hope needs to be based on the real world, that hope is real, but that the kind of hope that's not based on the real world leads to hopelessness, because we're kidding ourselves. It's better to open our eyes and see as much of reality as our minds and hearts and souls can take in, and God will help us to do that. That's what, and I believe that Paulo Freire was right about that. I'm not sure that that's the way that American culture wants to see things right now. But I think that's what I believe. All right, so for us to decolonize our own minds, one of the biggest hurdles that we have is to understand that we are part of the fabric of life. We are not separate from it. We never have been separate from it. So that the word environment, for example, can be a little misleading. People use it all the time. I heard Bill McKibben on the radio this morning using the word, you know, I do. It's not, the word is not evil or anything like that, but the word environment suggests something that's out there, you know, kind of separate from us, like the environment. And you look outside, right? That's true, but it's misleading because it's not separate. We are part of, have never been separate from, never will be separate from. When you are sitting in your rooms right now, you know, breathing, right? You are part of the whole fabric of life. It's not out there, it's in here too. You see what I'm saying? It's not a thing. It's not an object. It's not a commodity. We make it that, but that's not what it is. This is the essential spiritual point. It's really easy to forget that. The whole history of the Christian church, going back especially to the first few centuries, with the first, you know, like you know, with Saint Benedict, for example, and when the Desert Fathers and Mothers, there's essential insight about the sacred, is that God holds everything together, our lives together, that everything is woven together. But our problem is that we think we're separate from it. We think we are the center of our own worlds, right? That's basic sinfulness, pride, greed, right? So this is old traditional teaching, but it's what we forget. And if you I don't want to talk about churches. I don't mean this in a bad way, okay? But you know what I'm talking about. A lot of times, if you're listening to the radio or watching TV or so on around religion, it's hard to know sometimes how much that they're taking that seriously. It starts to look a little bit like capitalism, and sort of selling God rather than actually living in the spirit that we are already a part of. See, the spirit is trying to get our attention all the time, and we're paying attention to our own selves, right? This is, as we're all Christians, this is the basic temptation. And if you look at what's happening in the world now, we have not been doing very well on that. That's why the web of life is being torn apart. We have apparently been looking with good intentions, whatever that means, but with good intentions. So it's like we've been thinking of the environment, as it were, as kind of like a pantry for us just to take what we want. You see what I mean? You know what a pantry is? We have pantries up here in the Catskills. I don't know if y'all have pantries down. I'm just kidding. Okay, so in terms of, so what I'm talking about now is getting back to the heart and roots of our faith as the solution that we as Christians can make to the crisis that we are in. So this is my personal opinions and my personal beliefs. It's the way I live my life, but I believe that is really important. We're living in a time when people might say, well, religion has failed us. Okay? And young people might. And I can understand why they might say that, because they're looking to figure out what happened, and they are a little bit right and they're a little bit wrong about that. The Dalai Lama has said as much a couple of years ago, and his words were right, but he did not mean that faith is wrong. He meant that we have not followed the paths that we have been given. And maybe we've not been honest enough with each other in a loving way. And Jesus didn't tell us to go around judging people, right? So what I'm saying just now could be seen as judging, right? So how do we think our way through this and remain faithful? Okay, so for me, especially as a Franciscan, I'm going back to the heart of the faith as much as I know how and can. And what I have found is, if you look back to the Desert Fathers, the early Benedictines and the Franciscans, they talk about prayer, study, and work. Okay, they're great words, actually. By prayer, this is the key that I really want to say today. I got to look at the time a little bit because I feel myself getting on a roll, and time is going to fly. Okay, by prayer, what they really mean, and you and I can do this, and we are called to do this all the time. And what by prayer they mean, cultivating a sense of inner stillness. Okay. We can do that. Right now we have every opportunity in the world to do that because we're at home, right? By inner stillness, what that means really is, how we're talking to ourselves all the time. It's kind of an inner dialogue that we do. The teachers of the church are asking us to try to calm and slow that down. Basically, so we're just not talking to ourselves anymore, and so that we can listen to what the Spirit has to say. Now, the way to do that is by a prayerful meditation in which we actually For example, you can say the Jesus prayer, you know, as a kind of mantra, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. Or say it in any way you want to. It's not a magical formula. Okay? That's really what they're getting at. And once we do that, then we let the Spirit be part of our lives rather than being the center of our own worlds. It's the constant talking to ourselves. We kind of hypnotize ourselves. Now, that's a strong word a little bit, but it's kind of true. You see what I mean? Okay. By study, what they mean is discernment. That's really what the study means. So if you reading a book is good, thinking about it is good. I was giving a talk to some Franciscans and other church leaders in South America recently. We were talking about maps, for example, as a kind of text. And the question that comes up is like this. Let me put it another way. I had a dream this was about a year or two ago. I woke, you know how you wake up sometimes in the morning and you're still dreaming a little bit? And what happened with me was that I was hearing this voice in the dream say, do you know where you live? And I said in the dream, 32 Beehive Road, which is my address. You know, it was almost like a cop on the road had asked me, you know, for my driver's license, and I thought 32 Beehive Road. But then the voice in the dream responded and said, I know how to find you. I'm asking whether you know where you live. You see the difference? And that was the same kind of, it's a discernment kind of issue. Do we know where we live? For example, you know, in Manhattan, I know you live in Manhattan. What does it mean to live in Manhattan? What does it mean to live in Morningside Heights? You know, what is the water like? What are the racial situations? You know, what's the whole web of life, the fabric of life actually like? And the only way you can really know is to go talk to people and find out. You see what I mean? It's actually needing to go talk to people and find out. Okay, it's the same thing where up here in the Catskills, but we don't do that. We just talk to ourselves about it. You see what I'm saying? We're kind of stuck in we get stuck in our own thoughts. And I don't mean just in our culture, this happens in all cultures. It's the same, regardless of some are better than others about it, I'm sure. But that's what study really means. It's like go deeper within, like, who am I? Where do I live? You know, I mean, I don't want to let the political parties tell me. They will, right? I mean, Fox News and all the networks, you know, they've got me figured out as a, you know, advertising kind of thing. So we just can't absorb all of that study because it's not true. Okay. Prayer, study, and work. So then work, what does it mean to do good work as faithful Christians at a time when the fabric of life is being torn apart? It means that, and this goes back way back in the church, but it means it's not like we need to create new programs. There's nothing wrong with church programs, but there's a tendency for the church to be program-like we're a nonprofit organization. You know what? And not do the weaving together of our life together. That is what is going to get us through crossing the Red Sea. if we're not weaving together a community, a congregation, if we're not doing it each day, it's not going to happen. I mean, it's that building, rebuilding our society, our world in a way that we've been taught to do for 2,000 years. You know, I mean, there've been a lot of times when the church has gotten this wrong too, remember? And the church has forgotten the Inquisition, right? I mean, it's not like the church doesn't forget. I mean, we are the church and we forget. So it's time to remember. Last thing about this, remember in the Holy Eucharist, Jesus says, we hear it every Sunday, every time we go to the Eucharist, and the words are, do this in the remembrance of me, right? Do this in the remembrance of me. Okay, what the deeper meaning of remember is to let ourselves remember in our souls what we already know but have forgotten, because we're talking to ourselves too much. We've forgotten how to listen, forgotten how to listen to the trees and to each other. We think we've got each other figured out, right? That's the way the mind works, and we don't. We don't. Okay, so last thing, I don't think that Jesus is asking us to be right. Being right is fine, it's good, but Jesus is asking us to be loving. If we think that it's about being right, then we will divide the world up between us and them. But if we hear God's call as being loving above all else, then we will love our enemies. You see what I mean? It doesn't matter whether we're on the right or the left on that level. Okay, I think I better stop. Reverend Daniels, did I make sense?
I am totally here for everything that you said. It was so refreshing to hear everything that you said. Utterly refreshing. So thank you very much. I'm currently slogging through this beautiful book called Decolonial Love, which is, so I am right with you. I want to open the floor. Muriel, did you want to respond?
And I think Jody had a question. She had her hand raised too.
Yeah. Hi, good to see you again after all these years.
Hey, yeah.
And what I wanted to ask you to just say a few words about was, when you conceive of your enemies as the rich, the powerful, ExxonMobil, etc., how do you cast your thoughts about loving your enemies?
Okay. All right. So in my life, I've been arrested several times for peaceful protest. You know, I was never I was spent a day in jail, but was released. Charges were dropped. Most of those arrests were around police brutality issues. I'm very willing and able and so on to do peaceful, nonviolent protest. When that happens, my understanding of it is that I'm resisting evil, okay? But that doesn't mean that when I look someone in the eye who was on the board of Exxon or whatever, Goldman Sachs, I used to work with, he was on the board of my work at the UN. You remember when I was doing that work for the communion, I was at the cathedral. One of the chairman of the board for our work was also the head of Goldman Sachs. And we had discussions, a lot of discussions about, you know, fossil fuels and so on. And when I would look him in the eye and talk, as a Christian, I was not willing to let myself judge him as a person. You know, I disagreed with him. And he knew, I mean, we disagreed in a serious way. But he was not the kind of person who was going to try to destroy me, you know, by some means. Character assassination, there's all kinds, that happens all the time. If that had happened, and that's what's happening now in our political life, you know, and this is, so it's on a new level now. So that when that happens, then we have to find ways of being in solidarity in large groups like Martin Luther King did, that we're not really doing, there's not the solidarity yet. There's a lot of, it seems to me that there's a lot of agreement, but the agreement is on kind of thin ground. And when the ground shakes too easily. So we need to find a solidarity, especially around the issues around racial injustice and eco-justice. Those need to cut, they were together more 10 years ago than they are now. And that was the impact of white supremacy on our culture through the White House the last several years. I mean, in ways they divided the country in more subtle ways than was obvious to the majority of the public, because our country's racist, you know. And so that, to decolonize, we automatically have to bring together the tearing of the fabric of life and the tearing of our life together as a people. That they're one, they are one thing. And the powers that be will separate them, you know, to keep us kind of doing separate paths when it's always been one path, one Red Sea, you know, I was trying to stay in charge. So anyway, that's the long story of your question. But to me, we have to stand our ground without judging. And that, I was reading this morning in St. Francis, and he was writing to one of his brothers. This is an original letter from St. Francis. And he was saying, you know, what does true joy look like? His brother was asking Francis, and Francis replied by saying, imagine that I have come to your monastery this morning. Imagine I've come to St. John, to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine this morning, and I knock on your door, and it's raining outside, and it's blistering cold, and I'm hungry, and I need some refuge. And imagine then that someone comes to the door, you know, and says, no, we can't help you. And so I knock again, and the person says, no, I can't help you. And then Francis said, the moment of joy for him would be, for in that moment, for him to not give up or give in, to not give up or give in. And that means not to be judging. Isn't that weird? You know what I mean? Yeah. But that's exactly that sort of miracle moment that we're being asked to do. Now, I live around where I live, it's mainly fairly liberal people, but there are a lot of oath keepers that live around here. I did a funeral about 6 months ago for a person who is an oath keeper. I mean, you know who that is, right? In terms of okay. And I knew him because in a local diner, he would come in and sit down and talk with me sometimes, because he knew that we were on total opposite ends of the political spectrum, but he knew that I would listen to him, and he trusted me to be honest. Isn't that interesting? And so when it came time for his, you know, we were not good friends, but I see him around town. But then when he died, his son called me and said, would you officiate at his funeral? And I was thinking, you have got to be kidding. I didn't say that out loud, you know. And I get there and there's state troopers everywhere, you know, and like every conservative person that I know around here, I mean, like ultra conservative. And here I am doing his funeral. Yeah.
I've noticed recently, or I've been educated recently, right, in understanding the difference between consumer capitalism and finance capitalism, right? And when it comes to things like the environmental movement or ecological movements, it helps finance capitalism, right, to place responsibility, onus, blame on individuals for sort of changing their behaviors, right? So recycle, or do all of these individual things, right, to contribute to this sort of large scale global issue that really can only be transformed if entire institutions change the ways in which they operate. And so I'm wondering, so there's one level of sacrifice whereby, you know, I recycle more, I do these things, but there seems to be another level of sacrifice in order to get financial institutions and governments to transform the way they operate so that we might, have some kind of chance at surviving. What does that level of sacrifice look like for individuals in attempting to get entire institutions, entire governments to change the way that they operate? What's at stake in that in terms of how we have to change our lives?
I mentioned Paulo Freire earlier in liberation theology, and that the kind of question you're asking is the kind of question that he asked. Now, so I'm saying that in part to just remind us all that in 50 years ago, that kind of question was being asked more frequently. And then we've been living through 50 years in which it's being asked less and less and less. So in a certain sense, we need to be literate again about economic, political, human rights, you know, kinds of questions. And as a public, we're not at all right now. I'll come back to this in a minute, but I heard another word, I've forgotten who it was, Paul, but it was authoritarian capitalism, referring to the, you know, like in Brazil and the US and so on, what that kind of dynamic is probably important in our thinking too. But so anyway, Paulo Freire would answer your question by saying that what's needed is to reweave a sense of community so we can have a more of a kind of collective mind. I don't mean that in a bad way, a sense of a community soul, so that we can learn to think again. Because right now we don't know how to think, because we need the web of life. We need the community soul to help us learn how to think. So that's, you know, it's not like we can get from point A to point B very quickly or easily, but all I know is I just have to keep weaving, because the Spirit is saying, keep weaving, Jeffrey. You know, and you never know. You just never know. Sometimes one article written to a local newspaper, when you just, you know, sort of bare your soul saying, and I mean, maybe we need to learn how to write articles to newspapers again, so that they're not so finger pointy, you know, but soul opening. And people, I think people will respond to that. Some won't, but that, you know, that's when we knock the dust off our feet and keep walking. But I think that what we're missing now is the community part. And so until we get that back, it's going to be hard to confront the economic issues, because the authoritarian mind, which has control of the economic system now, even when it's not revealed in any particular nation. That's what's running the show. So in order to respond to it, we can't do it as individuals. We have to do it collectively. That's my opinion.
Go ahead, Sonia.
Yeah. Hi, Jeff.
Hey.
Two things came to my mind. First of all, I remember in the 70s and 80s, the National Council had this whole project about meatless,
Yeah.
one day that was meatless.
Yep.
And also the whole issue of environmental situation in for communities, people dumping refuge in those communities and how they're going to address those issues. And then the other thing I thought about is the displacement of indigenous peoples. When I think of Brazil and parts of Latin America, and how those even indigenous people in Canada, how they're coming together, coalescing to address the issue of the ecology. So I wanted you to address those two things.
Well, a lot of the work I'm doing now has to do with the Archbishop Mark MacDonald is the Indigenous Archbishop for Canada, and he and I work closely together on this. And he's taken a real leadership role in this. And we're putting together a film now that's going to be shown at the next Lambeth Conference to the Anglican Communion on the issue of why it is that the church needs to basically reparations for what it did in the colonial past to indigenous peoples, and that it's a little late in coming, but indigenous peoples want us to do that. The Franciscan order itself was, like, in the founding of our country, especially in the Southwest, the Franciscan order was horrible with this, and they were departing from the teachings. They were being colonized. The order was being colonized in that moment. That's what happened. Let me come back to, I was just thinking of this while you were asking, and this is for all of you, but do you remember and know Peggy Shepard in Harlem? You know, you might want, around issues around racial justice and environmental racism and so on, Peggy's pretty good, and y'all might want to have her and be involved. You might want to meet her, Paul. I used to work with her a lot, and especially like in Morningside Heights in Harlem, kind of bringing those communities together. That's an important thing to do in terms of walking our talk. About Meatless Days, that's going to be the big issue coming up, and I think some of the agriculture and food industry is trying to find alternatives to beef, for example, now. But that's something that we need to, that's as real of an issue as it was in the 70s and the 80s. That's not going away. That's a difficult one. I would put the issue of indigenous peoples and looking at our historical and colonial past. and we did that. I know when I was at the cathedral, remember during those, it was in starting with issues around Columbus Day and what was it called? The quincentennial, the 500 years and so on. And there was a lot of public discussion about, we didn't use the word decolonization then, but that was what was being discussed, and how can the church or a congregation have honest kind of prayers of forgiveness, especially in Lent, around historical collective sins that need to be forgiven. And that's a hard one. I mean, when I think of my own family, like I had, and this is on my mother's side of the family, a member of my family that we found out recently had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and no one knew it. And this, goes back a few generations. And so, I have to think through that, I mean, my family was definitely not like that at all, but it was like, what was going on, So my mama would not be happy for me telling you that, because she hated it when she found out. She absolutely, of course she hated it. So I have to, I might, that's the first time I've ever said that publicly. So I might need to reconsider, because I'm not sure what her wishes would be about this. My mom passed away in September. So that's why this is coming to mind. But that's a good example, though. You see what I mean? I mean, that's my family. And the church, when we think of the church, the history of the church, that's our family. You see what I mean? It really is. So it's time to make things right. When there's people, I know one of the bishops in Brazil right now, and when I talk to him, when we Zoom about this, he's telling me what's happening, both with COVID and with deforestation and so on, to the indigenous peoples in Manaus and in Guaratieri. I almost lived in Brazil myself anyway. There are tears in his eyes, and he's asking for help. That's what he's doing. He's asking for help. And so we're trying to do what I can in the order about that. And he's asking you for help too. There are ways to do that with, I think we think these days that there's not a way. We think the community ties have been cut so much, and communication is so wacky in our lives now, that we think that we can't be good agents of change. And I think that we've been hypnotized.
I think both Marcia and Muriel had their hands up, so I want to just give them an opportunity to.
Well, my comment, first of all, it's really great to see you, Jeff, and to hear you again.
Me too.
What a thrill. It has to do with community and very local. What's going on all over the world is so overwhelming, but even locally, I ran into an issue a few years back when I guess it was probably Mayor Bloomberg decided that garbage would be picked up in the East 90s. You know how they consolidate all the garbage trucks come and dump what they brought. And I was volunteering at the ASPCA on East 91st Street. And ladies from the neighborhood, the Upper East Side, were coming around with petitions because they did not want this to happen. This cannot happen on the Upper East Side, that they would build a dock and all these garbage trucks would come by. And I tried to convince people that, in fact, you make garbage too. Where do you think it should be? There's still plenty of dumping spots on the West Side. It's not a big deal. You shouldn't fight this. And I got nowhere. I was very ineffective. But in fact, the head of the ASPCA Adoption Center signed it, which I was really appalled at, because they love little animals, but they just don't care about, Anyway, so I think there's so much to do just locally. And some of us are just very ineffective at it, just very ineffective, but we try. That's all I had to say.
Well, what the story I was just telling a few minutes ago about St. Francis, knocking on the door and no one, everybody saying no, even his best friend saying, no, I can't help you. But it's in those moments, we're being tempted to either give up or give in. And it's so frustrating, it's the frustration. But pick up your, Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me, and then my yoke is easy, my burden is light. We just got to keep carrying it. And that I used to think that was just words more than I do now. Now I realize that that's the gospel truth, and that even in those moments when I before the election, sometimes I was wondering, I'll have to tell you, but what's happening here. And Asha, you remember, is Jewish, and you could remember we have a very interfaith kind of world view of the world and so on. And we were thinking about, okay, is this all coming back from the 30s, and we just absolutely cannot let ourselves give up or give in on any of this now. And I think of it in terms of kindness, showing kindness to the stranger, that little, or that conversation that you had, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have more. conversations.
And
We
in
just
fact,
talked about it.
they never did. I mean, Mayor Bloomberg stuck to his guns, and that's, you know, but could not affect those people. I didn't
Yeah.
think.
Well, that is where I remember Jesus. I think it was, you know, where I don't remember, but he did say sometimes you just have to kind of knock the dust off your feet and, you know, just go to the next person or next town or something. I don't know. Sometimes I get overwhelmed sometimes when it's not depressed, but it's like I'm carrying a lot of bags, you know. So for me, this is the way it's played out, but I feel like I'm cleaning up, and so I'm carrying garbage, you know. And so what I forget to do is to take care of myself, which means to set down, you know, the garbage, to set it down, even my own, you know. Don't carry this stuff anymore, Jeff, you know, let it go. And it's not helping, but I identify with it because it's my own personal history, you know what I mean? It's like I know it, but that's me talking to myself. And that's where just stop, Jeff, just stop talking to yourself. And I spend a couple hours a day in silent meditation. I always have, but in the last couple of years, it's become much, much more important than it. I wish I had known that 40 years ago. I knew it, but I just was too busy, right? Oh, there was someone else that was gonna, Muriel, right?
Gotta unmute.
Muriel,
Okay, can you hear me now?
yeah.
Okay. This week on Monday, actually, Monday morning, a friend of my sister, my niece, was head of a international women's breakfast at the UN. And it was the most incredible thing because the woman who spoke was from they call them Native Canadian, one of the reservations.
Yeah.
And she was the first woman to become a chief.
Wow.
And she was the most dynamic speaker. And she talked about self-care, the importance of self-care. But the thing was that she was entirely honest. She started off by saying, you know, I wasn't educated. I went to the last time I went as far as high school, but she never went to college. And she just was very open about what her limitations were. But, you know, she was able to, first of all, she told us how she had to confront the other chiefs because they were men. And she said, you guys sit there and you don't say anything. And they said, well, we're waiting for you. And she spoke up and she was able to get funding. She'd say, you know, like for the energy from the wind towers, she's able to negotiate. She'd say, well, half of the money came from the federal government and so much came from the provincial. And she was such a dynamite person. It was like really an eye opener for me. And I thought, and she said, don't be afraid of speaking up. There's no such thing as a silly question.
That's
And
right.
she was unbelievable. So that next time I go to Canada, I'm going to go to that reservation and see what it's like. Anyway, I really admired that situation, but she did keep stressing you have to do self-care too.
Yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise you burn out.
I was at a conference on water in Stockholm a few years ago, and they brought in young people, younger, you know, whatever. But anyway, there was a young woman from Canada, Indigenous woman, and it was kind of like Greta, you know, a little bit. But
Yes.
I mean, the voices from all, maybe there were 4, I think, they were all young women. And those, to me, I felt like I was hearing the voice of the future. And it was clear and humble, but bold at the same time.
Uh-huh.
You know, and that was, I thought that was just the sign of, you know, so men will, if things go well, I think women are better weavers than men. And men are going to have to learn how to weave, not manage, but weave. you know, and that's what leadership looks like now. And I think that that young men are learning how to weave without even realizing it. I think it's just what the Spirit is doing, but it's building community, not managing. Guys are taught to manage. Seminaries teach us to manage. Universities teach us to manage. And I'm not saying institutions don't have an aspect of it that requires something like that, but it's the weaving that makes the institution alive, not the management. I did not say that. If the dean hears me say that, I just realized I'm being recorded. I am already in trouble. You know what I'm talking about.
Yes. She was always saying, don't give up, don't give up, you know.
Give up.
Yeah.
Don't give up.
John, did you have a question?
No, I don't have a question, just a comment. Jeff, some
Hey.
of my best ancestors were weavers by trade.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Hey.
yeah, but I have been sitting here listening to what you've had to say, and I increasingly in the last several months, and certainly the last few years, I said, perhaps if we could give up, no, the universe does not revolve around, or we should give up, no, the universe does revolve or revolves around me, and this is something we all have to give up. If it revolves around me, it can't revolve around you, and I'm afraid that's really not the case. It revolves, is that it's between God and us, okay?
Yeah.
Or God and we,
I know.
which is a whole different dynamic.
Yep.
Mm.
Well, remember in the old teaching, the cross, pick up your cross, the cross becomes the tree of life. And that happens as we are no longer the center of our own world, you know, it's like that's
Mm.
the tree becomes the cross becomes the tree. Laura, what were you going to say?
I was going to first comment that my family has stock in Exxon, and I don't think we're going to give it up. But second, could you talk a little more? I think it's very interesting what you said about listening to your community around you. And I wondered, what do you mean by that vis-a-vis the cathedral specifically? Are we just saying, oh yes, we should be do better environmentally, but not really figuring out what people need to make that happen in our local community? Is that sort of what you're suggesting? Is that we're not listening, we're just pontificating?
Okay, so I'm not at the cathedral, you know, right? And I have no idea really what life is like there now. Okay, so keep that in mind.
Very quiet.
Okay. All right. So regardless of where we are now, we live, so it wouldn't matter whether we're talking about the cathedral or the cathedral in Washington or Westminster Abbey, where it wouldn't matter. But we're living in a time in which we're becoming less part of the communities of where we live. It's this odd thing that's happening. And it's, so anything that we can do, and that can often mean even finding out, for example, where you are in Morningside Heights in Harlem, you know, what are the community meetings? Who's having meetings? And I'll bet you you don't know, because and you're not being different from other communities now. That is the modern pattern. Yes, I'm sorry, you got your hand up?
Oh, it's Joanne. I just wanted to say that 2 years ago, Paula, who was on the vestry, was investigating how to, kind of green up our disposal at the cathedral. But but we never got on to the next level up, bigger than the vestry. And I think that was done, and then it just faded away. It became impossible for just the vestry and the congregation. Marcia?
Go on. I was just going to add something.
Well, that I just mean that it has come up in the recent past. I think you were not on the vestry, but I was, and then that happened, and Paula did it. Robert was there as well, but it's really hard. I understand as our community grows on Zoom, the virtual community, our literal physical community kind of disappears.
I want to say that we actually have had, through members of the congregation, mostly Neil, who works for works for the New York State Senate, actually, there's been a lot of outreach to other churches in the neighborhood, and projects have been done with other churches for, handing out food and doing that kind of thing. So there is some awareness, and there could be a lot more. And certainly CCC, Community Cares, is doing a lot more than they have been doing. And the congregation is more involved in that now, which is great. But this is not environmental. This is like what we're in now. People are starving. We got to feed them. That's kind of what's going on, right?
Okay, but the way you just put that, that's really important, Marcia. So what the shift that kind of gets us to where we can be more sort of deeper and more effective is that when that kind of work is going on, that is part of the weaving, so it is environmental in the sense that your community is part of the larger fabric of life. See what I mean? The word can be misleading, but it just needs to be, the scope needs to be expanded, and we're going to have to get a face-to-face life back. That's where there's no doubt about that. We have to get that back.
Yeah.
But all I know is, like, when I was living there, I would spend, and I do the same here when I'm up in the little town where I live now, but I spend a lot of time just in the community talking with people, getting to know people by first name. And so that when someone in Harlem says, do you know the cathedral? They say, oh yeah, I know Marcia and Muriel, you see what I mean? It's not just an image, but the person. And that can be done. It's not hard. But I think that's where the weaving happens, and then the other conversations happen. I mean, I would not discount letters to the, personal letters to local, Facebook or newspapers or whatever. I don't love Facebook, but you know what I mean. I wouldn't discount any possibility right now, because I think people are really, that we all know that there's a storm coming. And I think in our souls that we know what to do. We just gotta, we've got to kind of decolonize ourselves a little bit.
I think Ruth had something to say.
Where's Ruth?
Yeah.
Sorry, the moment has passed. My question doesn't fit anymore. No problem. Thank you.
Hey, Ruth.
I'd like to say something. Jeff, I'm reading this book, Care
Mhm.
for Creation,
Yeah,
Franciscan Spirituality of the Earth.
yeah. I know the book.
It's
Good book.
excellent. Yeah.
That's a good book. That's a good book. Great.
Any other questions? No. Thank you very, very much, Jeff. Can you
Oh,
hear me?
pleasure's all mine. Thank you. Thank you for asking me.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. I wanted to say thank you for the people here, everyone who came. And I want to alert you to the fact that Jeff is great at writing articles for the Episcopal New Yorker. So you have to keep your eye open for his wonderful articles. And I've enjoyed them through the years. They've been really good. And so keep your eye open for those. And I just want to say on behalf of the group, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience in this area of climate change and sacred ecology, and for encouraging us to address our relationship with God's creation. We certainly do need to address the ecosystem that is being greatly challenged today, and to take action so that we live in harmony with God and God's creation. And thank you so very, very much for coming.
Oh,
Or
man.
for being with us. I keep saying coming, but I mean being with us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see you all. Thank you very much. This is great.
Good to see you.